So we're doing civic culture, interfaith disposition and civic culture, Samar and I. But I'm actually want to ask everybody to stand up right now and stretch. Like stretch your arms as high as you can, bend over, turn around in a circle. That's right, hokey pokey. Take a deep breath. Okay, now you can sit down. Because this is the bad slot. We all know this is the bad slot. But I'm just going to tell you 3 stories. So I'm the 3 stories, the overall banner over the 3 stories is faith-rooted organizing as a tool for interfaith bridge building. So I'm going to talk a little bit about faith-rooted organizing. What is that? And then I'm going to give a story about faith-rooted organizing as a tool in bridge building generally. And then I'm going to do a very specific story about faith-rooted organizing as a tool in interfaith bridge building. So I was trained in 1980 in faith-based organizing. I am that old, if you were wondering. I am that old. In faith-based organizing. Now, faith-based organizing is a standardized model, and it's a model that uses faith as a motivation for getting involved in systemic community change. But it sees interfaith as lowest common denominator because it sees a certain kind of uniformity as building power. So you have to all have the same talking points so that your message is as clear and as powerful as possible, right? So then I went to the Philippines and I was a missionary and I was part of the pro-democracy movement against the Marcos dictatorship. And in that movement, I saw a completely other kind of organizing. Just to start with, the movement was not organized geographically. There weren't 2 representatives from each of the islands. It was organized sectorally. So there were 2 representatives from the farmers, and there were 2 from the students, and there were 2 from the churches, and there were 2 from the mothers, and there were 2 from the Muslims. And I said, wait a minute. What if you're a farmer and a student and a mother and a Christian? Where do you fit? And they said, wherever you're called to contribute. So this understanding that a movement was like a body and every body part had a role. And so when I came back to the United States afterwards, I thought, and this was just one of many differences, but I thought, what would it look like for us to see faith engagement through those lenses? So that our particularities weren't something to be ignored, they were actually gifts to be utilized. So faith-rooted organizing says that we go as deep as we can into our wells and we bring that out for the whole. So that's a definition. I've actually written a book on it. If those of you who like books, it's called Faith-Rooted Organizing, you can look it up. And the book is basically a snapshot of what we were doing at this particular point. So I'm going to tell you now, I'm going to give you a story about faith-rooted organizing as a tool for bridge building. The first part of the story is actually not about faith, but you won't understand the second part till I tell the first part. And the first part is actually a great example of bridge building. So I got to sit at the table for the peace process in Central America. I was very young. The only reason why I was at the table was that it wasn't the UN table. The UN peace process at that particular point was stuck. It had stopped. It was not moving any farther. There had been a war over 30 years in Guatemala, at that point 16 years in El Salvador. And there was so much anger and hunger for vengeance in those countries that the peace process couldn't move forward. So Dr. Oscar Arias of Costa Rica organized a behind-the-scenes roundtable, and I worked for an international Lutheran organization that raised $1 million for the process. So one of us was allowed to sit at the table. I was obviously not at a high level in the organization. I was very young, but I was the only one who spoke Spanish fluently. So I got to watch. So at the beginning, part of what Dr. Arias did differently is he didn't just have the generals and the rebel leaders. He had the top representatives of every sector of society present. So he had the top business leaders. He had the top union leaders. He had the top political leaders. He had the archbishop. He had the top university leaders. He had the heads of the civil society organizations. So the mothers of the disappeared had to sit next to the generals who had ordered the disappearances. The tension in that room when I walked in, it felt like it was going to blow up any minute. It was horrible. So Dr. Arias started the process by handing out little index cards and asking everyone to write their dreams for their country in 20 years. And then they had to put their dreams on the wall and share them with everyone. Do you think their dreams were similar? They were. And as they began to talk about that, they wanted prosperity, they wanted for the youth in particular, right? As they did that, something happened in the room, that the potential for the future became more powerful than the pain of the past. The potential for the future became more powerful than the pain of the past. And over the next 3 days, they came up with the agreements reflected in the formal peace accords 2 weeks later. So that's not a faith-rooted story, although it's a good story about bridge building. So fast forward, Los Angeles, and terrible conflict between the African American and Hispanic immigrant communities. Terrible. I mean, gangsters killing each other, but at all levels, conflict. And so we have this network of Hispanic and Black pastors, and we say, we're going to use the Oscar Arias. It's not really a network. It's sort of a network, but it doesn't really active because the tension is so deep. So we say, we're going to use the Oscar Arias exercise. So we do. People put up their dreams on the wall in 2 languages, but they're the same dreams, and it isn't working. And we're desperately, we're on break. We're trying to figure out, like, why isn't this working? And we realize that nobody in that room believes that our dreams can come true. I mean, great that we have the same dreams. The pie is still too small. So then we ask everybody, what are God's dreams for South Los Angeles? And people start coming up with scriptures. And a laughter goes through the room. And it's the laughter of Sarah in the biblical story. When she hears something that's too good to be true, and it's true. And she laughs. It's that laughter. And then the magic happened, and people came together. So that's faith-rooted, but they were using scriptures. So now I want to bring that to an interfaith story. So I was running an organization called CLU, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, an interfaith organization. We were supporting a variety of different campaigns for economic justice. And one of the campaigns was the security guards. So security guards at that particular point were primarily African American in Los Angeles, almost like 85%. And they worked for guard companies. Now, what does that mean? It means that there's a lowest bid process, right? So the guard company with the lowest bid gets the contract. But what that means is that that company has no way to pay a living wage. They have no way to pay health insurance. In fact, there's such high turnover because people are risking their lives as security guards and they can't get health insurance and they can't get living wages. There's such high turnover that they don't even train people. It's not worth their while to train people. So you have people risking their lives who aren't even trained. So the union is trying to organize them, SEIU, but you can't organize them because of that bidding process. It's just not possible. There's no money. So there is this concept called responsible bidding, where a company says we're going to start with a floor that allows for people to have a living wage and health insurance. Why would anybody do that? Well, religious convictions, maybe. If you understand that Torah says that these things matter, and if you're observant, then you might do that. So, Building Owners and Managers Association. And CLUE, by the way, is we are organizing the faith leaders. We are the faith part of faith, community, union, economic justice. So we have some freedom to just bring our faith. So the two largest owners of buildings, commercial buildings, in Southern California is a faithful Catholic and an observant Jew. So thinking about your company, the two largest owners. So we're like, what are we going to do to convince them to take on a responsible contracting policy? Because if they do, everybody else will follow them. So we have some rabbis who learn that this man is actually, he's conservative and he's observant. And so the rabbis are like, we're going to talk to him. We're coming up on the high holy days. And, he's going to listen to us. The problem is that he keeps doing something that is called the slow no. That's what I found out, which is that he keeps telling them that he's going to meet with them and then canceling the meeting over and over again. So we create an interfaith action together, and this is the action. So this is the very beginning of the High Holy Days. It's about to happen. And we have some rabbis, and they have honey, with sticks of honey, because this is something that you do, in a little basket, and they want to get in to see him. And we have a bunch of pastors and leaders from African American congregations. And the pastors and the leaders are of all ages, come in and they start a gospel prayer service on the ground floor of the building where he has his offices on the top. So they're doing this gospel prayer service. And, if anybody's been in a gospel prayer service, it's rousing, right? I mean, the tenants come out to listen. They're singing along. It's great music, right? The police are called. The police come, and they decide they're going to wait till the service is over. Ha ha, right? That service doesn't have to be over for days, right? So they go up, and they talk to one of the pastors that seems to be leading the service. And, so an elderly woman takes over. And then they go up to talk to her, and an 11-year-old takes over. I mean, there's no way to stop that service, right? They're going to have to arrest all of them to stop the service, which they're not going to do. So the guy who's on the top floor, he says he has no connection with African-American pastors. So he says, sure, send him up. So, of course, the rabbis are waiting around the corner. So the rabbis go up instead. And they meet with him. And they say, there's a tradition that during the week that people's names are written in the book of life or not. And this is a question of Torah, this responsible contracting policy. So they say, we're going to come back at the end of the week. So during that week, that man decides to institute a responsible contracting policy through all of his buildings, and he announces it. And it is the beginning of the whole Building Owners and Managers Association adopting the policy. So the rabbis did what they did. The African American churches did what they did. It was their particular gifts. It was the rainbow that had the power, not uniformity. Now, there was a lot of conversation about that. That was not simple. None of that work was simple, because how do we incorporate our differences without offending each other? That's not a simple question to answer. And so there was a lot of conversation. But this is only one of many, many stories that I could share with you. So I'm going to stop there. Nobody slept. Yay.
Love it. Thank you. I mean, so many things came to mind in listening to you, and including that, about gifts and values, and also about it's not easy work. And I get this question a lot, and I bet a lot of people around the table also get this question, which is, but how do you talk to people who you vehemently disagree with and you feel like you're violating your values by even platforming them? How many people have got that question, have received that question in the past year, right? Almost everybody. And I oftentimes think about, but what values are you also violating by not engaging? And what about those values if you're somebody who wants to be in community with your neighbors? If you're somebody who wants to do good in the world and do good work with people, is that a value that you also have? If one of your values is forgiveness, if one of your values is generosity, so where does that play into all of this as well? If one of your values is democracy, and et cetera. And so I feel like that's kind of something that I oftentimes think about too, is if in challenging moments, whereas I'm saying I have to be what makes sense for me, even when sometimes it might feel like there's a misalignment on other values that we're coming to the table around. And one of the most, so a couple of examples, and then I'm going to go into some more systematic work with everybody, but is about peace. Peace is a very important value. It's one of the things I said when I first sat down. And if some of you might recall, about 13, 14 months ago, it became controversial to say that you are for peace. And part of my heritage is also Palestinian. So you can imagine also the controversy around the interpretations that one might have around a Palestinian Syrian southern woman saying that she is for peace and that she's working for peace. I had a lot of people asking me a lot of questions. And as luck would have it, and it was already scheduled to happen. In August, I was invited, right after having a baby, to give a TED Talk in New York on peace and about talking across divides in America and addressing polarization in America. And I was standing there, and I gave the TED Talk in November, right after October 7th. And I stood next to the president of TED, and I said, I'm about to go on this stage and say the word that so many people are considered to be very controversial right now. Well, let's go. Lights, camera, action, and we went. But my point on that is to say and I talked about conflict profiteerism as well. Conflict profiteerism versus peace seekers, and shifting this whole friend versus enemy narrative into that, and saying that should I let conflict profiteers take away my dream for peace? They can take away a lot of other things, but they're not going to take away that dream. I'm going to actually double down on working towards it and explaining what is meant by it. As well, and also put action behind the word, give meaning to those words in the everyday activities, and evaluating the different work that I'm doing from global to local. So I'll give just two quick examples before I get into some of the more professorial stuff, and that is I was asked, and I believe in signs, and I was asked to be the vice chair of the baptism site for the chair of I know everybody's looking like, what? The U.S. Foundation for the Bethany Beyond the Jordan site, which is where Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. And I remember where I was standing when I received the call, and I said, and I knew the person who was calling me, and they knew, and I was like, I was puzzled a little bit, and I said, why me exactly? And I hope that you're not. I said, I hope there are going to be a lot of Christians on this board. That's what I said. And they said, well, we think that we need somebody who has your peacekeeping skills and who understands the complexity of this particular area, and has got those practical skills in the real time. And I said, well, let me go to the site and see. And I'm actually going to be in Jordan next week. And so I went to the site, and I was overwhelmed by a feeling of peace. And I wish I could share with you, and I have it recorded, but the sound that I even heard around me of the rustling of some of the bushes around me. And I looked out into the Holy Land that I was surrounded by, and I stood where Jesus stood when he was baptized. And 5 minutes before, I was standing where he stayed in the cave of John the Baptist the night before he was baptized. And I saw no man-made borders. And I just experienced that Holy Land and what they would have seen in that moment, too. And I thought, I want to be a part of this. Yes, I am Muslim. And yes, this is a Muslim majority country, and we need to do this right. But there's some kind of a calling that's happening right now. This is interfaith work. And I found myself too on work, and I've now been working on this board for 2 years, and I'm helping with a lot of different denominations on the Christian side, and I'm learning so much, and I love to learn, and I'm very curious. And all of a sudden, yes, things have gotten harder after October 7th, kind of given what's happening in the region, but it's also made it so much more. It's actually helped center us even much more around the original message of Jesus. And so I feel like I really truly am on this journey of interfaith and understanding what it means, along with just reflecting a lot about the family that I'm married into. They help open and close the Church of the Holy Sepulchre every single day in the old city of Jerusalem. And that happened over 100 years ago because they were like, we don't want any one Christian denomination to feel like they have more power over the other. So we wanted to have this trusted Muslim family that we're going to give the keys to do this. That's interfaith work. That's that trust piece that we're also talking about, that yes, we belong to different, we might belong to different faiths, but what kind of responsibility do we have to each other, even if we decide to belong to different faiths? I started my early years and my early education in a Baptist church school. I'm working on a book right now, and my editor joked, and she said, the story of your life is that it keeps coming back to baptism. It's very interesting. And it really truly does. It's very, very interesting. But I remember when the preacher of the school wanted to ask me if I wanted to be baptized, and I said no. And he continued to treat me the same way that he had before I had said no. And that gave me the sigh of relief when I was this 7-year-old girl at that moment, wondering, like, am I going to be treated differently because I've made this decision? And I think that piece right there where I continued to feel like I belonged was so important. And then I went to a Catholic school, and then I was completely confused. And so I went to a public school, but it really stayed with me, all of that. And my oldest sister is also Catholic, and I'm a practicing Muslim. And we've had a lot of these moments together. So kind of pulling that back into the hyperlocal here in the United States with that frame. And with that frame of mind, and I will just say this too, one of the goals for the baptism, and I am the only Muslim, by the way, on the U.S. board for the baptism site. And it's really, I've already said it a million times, it's really interesting, but one of our goals is to make that site accessible to as many people as possible, and so that as many Christians as possible can visit that site in peace and take that pilgrimage and have that experience in a place in the world that so many people feel and fear is inaccessible to them or is too dangerous. So this has informed a lot of my work, including just some of the work that I did in South Africa. I had one of the privileges of a lifetime to live and work with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his family, which informed a lot of what you're talking about with regards to that the dream, the rainbow, the believing in what can be rather than being paralyzed paralyzed by fear. And one of the things that Archbishop Tutu told me at the time was like, well, if you want to be a lawyer, you also need to work with lawyers and not just, clergymen. So he introduced me to Chief Justice Chaskelson, who was Mandela's lawyer, and also Justice Edwin Cameron, who just retired from the Constitutional Court. And they helped me to think about these constitutional skills and lawmaking that goes into how do we protect these values and these systems and these norms that allow for us to exist in this pluralistic society which supports supports this interfaith work that we're trying to do, and et cetera. And so where does the part of justice come in? Where does the part of mercy come in? How do they work together? What is the role of faith? And so from there, that really informed the work that I'm doing at Millions of Conversations. And so at Millions of Conversations, I remember after I worked in the government, after I worked in the White House, and I moved back to Tennessee, I got a number of people who called and asked if I was having a third life crisis. And they said, usually it's the reverse. Usually people go from the state level up. This was before COVID. And what are you doing? And I'm like, I just experienced what I experienced in DC. And what I felt was that I was becoming further and further away from the work. And that I'm worried about being dishonest. Or about being a bad leader almost, because like I'm walking the walk and I'm talking the talk and I understand how the policy making works and et cetera, but I'm further removed from the people, and I really believe in the people. And also, just of the walled off nature that the White House itself was becoming and that government was becoming, and the trust deficit. And I really just felt that I needed to go back to my roots, literally. And they were, what about your international career? And I'm like, well, I'm just going to figure it out. And, there are flights out of Nashville. In essence, we invested there. And I really had a lot of questions coming back after government. And I also found myself, and some of you might know this, some of you do know this, I know, in the middle of they didn't have a word for it yet, but I was in the middle of a disinformation attack against me, so severe that the FBI investigated somebody for attempted murder. There were billboards that had my face and on it saying that I was a terrorist. There was resolutions being written to be introduced on the floor of the state legislature in Tennessee designating me as an enemy of the state, and there were resolutions that passed in counties across the state of Tennessee. And one person even said, well, what did you expect when you went back to the rednecks? And it was then that I said, if I survive this, what I want to do is to help be a part of the solution that builds and helps foster an ecosystem that allows for our pluralistic reality and the dream of our democracy and the promise of this country to be realized by us this century. It's not something we can take for granted. So what will that look like? What can that look like? How do we deal with this whole online information ecosystem that's happening, along with the community building work that we still need to do in person? So I kind of went through this journey. I'll spare you the details of the rest of the journey that I went through. Had a lot of different stops along the way, including, we were just talking about this in Damascus, but all roads lead to Damascus. But seriously, I came to this conclusion that in order to do global work really well, we have to be hyper-local, and that it's really difficult for America to do the work that we have the potential to do in the world if we ourselves are not healthy at that local level, and if we ourselves are not practicing what it is that we preach. So what does that exactly look like? So along those ways, what I've developed is what I call the 7 steps to peace. And I'm going to walk you through it in a minute, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the programming that we do, and then I'll stop. But, and I first talked about this when I was working on a speech for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They asked me to talk about this in September 2019. And I was thinking, okay, I feel like a lot of people are getting lost when I'm speaking, and I need to figure out a way to make this accessible. So I'm going to create some steps, and I'm going to describe how the negative norm setting cycle works that authorizes environments for cruelty and brutality and violence. And then I'm going to talk about how to break that cycle and get on a pathway towards peace. I'm going to describe it. A lot of these words have already been said in this room. I'm just going to talk about the sequence. And this happens online, what's happening online is it's happening with such speed that it's difficult for us to do what we've done in the past to break these cycles of violence because of the momentum and the speed of which it's happening. So the first thing is labeling. This is an age-old trick. Okay, so the first step is you label the other. So, when I went to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, for example, in 2019, there's for those of you who have been there, there's an entire exhibit that takes you through how the demonization process of Jews happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century Europe, starting in Austria. It will take you through that. And this is that pathway, the demonization, the labeling of the other. So there is an enemy that you designate and you say, this is what they look like, this is who they are. That's that labeling process. That labeling process takes you to this next piece, which is you build on existing animosity or you create the animosity. Then you've got that animosity whipped up. That animosity leads to you blame the other for, you name it, your economic ailments, the traffic. How many of you have heard people say, well, there's so much traffic now because of all those immigrants who've come in or all those people who've moved in, or, the inflation is happening because of, we had, for example, a mass shooting and the Covenant School, a Christian church, a Christian school in Nashville, Tennessee. And somebody that I know said, well, if it hadn't been for all those illegal immigrants, it would have never happened. Literally, she said that. I was like, oh, no. I think we're confusing things here. Like these, but that was where her mind automatically went. This is the programming. This is the conditioning. That blame leads to fear, beginning to fear that other. That fear leads to anger. And then so they say, they've changed our way of life. One of the things that was said about me is we are concerned and suspicious about her way of life. Like that was one of the things that was said about me. She's the camel's nose under the tent. She's a financial jihadist. She's a terrorist. This is the labeling. So then what happened with the person who was writing things online about saying that he wanted to kill me and take me out? In part, he's like, I have to get to her before she gets to me. It's that friend versus enemy of if I don't, and also it's my patriotic duty to take her out. That was when I also realized how deep this had gone about me and how much danger I was also in, because of how the justification of it was working and also happening. So that anger can turn to hate, and then the hate turns to violence. And that violence can happen when someone, depending on where they are, for example, they didn't call it this at the time, but on Christmas Day 3 years ago in downtown Nashville, Tennessee, we had a suicide bomber. We had somebody who had radicalized on these conspiracy theories that I'm talking about right now. He blew himself up in a van in downtown Nashville and took out a block of the downtown area, and the electricity grid was wrecked for days. He was trying to do much more damage, and thankfully nobody else died, but that is what happened. So this is that negative cycle. So where does interfaith come in? And how do we break that cycle? And how do we get on the pathway to peace? Well, the first step is something that came up in the first session today, and that is listening. So the first step is listening. That's first step and figuring out how to do it online that transfers to offline and vice versa, and getting that nexus right between online and offline. So the first step is listening. The second step is humanizing. That and we can talk about the how piece, and I'll do that in a minute. The humanizing. That next step is empathy, which is something that Mark, that you brought up as well. Like that empathy. Many people will say we need more empathy. We can't start automatically with empathy if we don't train that listening muscle. The next step is values, identifying our shared values. That's not meaning that we have all of the same values. It's saying, do we have enough? And I would recommend at least 4. The next is something also that was said, a commitment to a shared future. I mean, you brought that up too. What does our future look like together? Do we want to have a shared future? And so once somebody commits to, this is again, these are the listening piece, the values piece, the shared future piece. It's not prescriptive. People are opting in. You're bringing them in. Your restoring agency is designed to do that so people feel like they're part of that process. The next step is truth and reconciliation. And that is, what is our experience with facts that shapes our truth? And how do we reconcile with that in a way of where we feel like we might have wronged each other, we might have felt like we wronged each other, but we're going to try really hard not to do it again. And that gets to that trust piece too. I see you. and you see me. That's that belonging piece too, of where, again, back to Heather's point earlier, it's not individualistic, it's communal, which is a key piece to that she highlighted. And then that leads, in my opinion, to what I call peace. Other people use other words. Some people will call it unity. Pick your word that you want to use it. For me, peace is the one that resonates with me. So I'll just touch on this and then I'll stop talking. And that is, we have something at Millions of Conversations called the Pledge to Listen. I'll just read it, and anyone's invited to take it. It's, I pledge to listen to others who hold different opinions, values, or beliefs. I will try to understand their reasons and perspectives and will respectfully express my own in return. That begins that process that we hope that people join us on towards that pathway that starts with listening. We have a facilitation training around Pledge to Listen that we also do, which is what's interesting too, is it's cut across industries. We've been invited to do this in synagogues and churches and mosques, for the Girl Scouts, for independent schools, for public schools, for Harvard, for Alliance Bernstein, in different places as well. It's really interesting how cross-cutting this has been. And then also we are two other pieces I'll just say about our programming around it. It's led to these conversationalist series that we do. I'm very proud to say that we've had a series of conversationalist series around preparing for peace with the Jewish Federation in Middle Tennessee and the Islamic Center of Nashville, and also Woodmont Christian Church and several other institutions in Nashville and Middle Tennessee. We've had 4 of these now. One of the reasons I came in early this morning was because we had one last night. That happened with 200 people who were in the room who've been doing this work together now for over a year, and it's been following. And it's been, and I'm not saying that it hasn't been tense, but how have we been working through that, in what ways? And then we'll also create content from it that we place online to try to disrupt some of these algorithms. And then lastly, we have our 3142 program, which stands for the number of counties in America. So there are 3,142 counties, and we're looking to repave the roads between counties. We talked about rural as well. And so how do we get our rural counties having the infrastructure and the civic infrastructure that's needed for local leaders to feel connected with each other inside the faith, and also through interfaith work, and also just at the public library level, to do things together that then helps them. And I'll give you a quick example. We are doing work in Humphreys County in Tennessee that just experienced one of the most devastating floods in the world. The roads were literally washed up between the counties in that instance. And the junior high school was demolished, and the elementary school was demolished. And so Millions of Conversations came in and said, how can we help? And the principal said, I need a computer lab because the kids need to learn how to code, and we want to start a robotics club. So we said, okay, let's do it. And we did it. And now they have a robotics club, and we went to check out the robotics club after a year of working on this. And I said, what's next? What can we do next? And they said, well, we would love to sort of like have exchanges with other counties. And I said, well, do you know anybody at the Adventure Science Museum in Nashville, Tennessee? And they said, no, we don't. Can you connect us? And I said, absolutely. So now they're connected into the main science museum in that state. These are the little things. Let me have one very quick thing too. Is Hamilton County, which is where Chattanooga sits, and Grundy County, which is one of the poorest counties in the in the country, where life expectancy is declining dramatically. One of the oldest United Way foundations in Tennessee, in the country, is in Chattanooga. It's 105 years old. We asked Greater Chattanooga, okay? Grundy County's 30 minutes from Chattanooga. We said, do you include Grundy County in your giving as a part of Greater Chattanooga? And they said no. I said, can you consider it? And they said yes. They went to the board, and then they decided we can include them in part of Greater Chattanooga, and now they're giving grants to Grundy. Grundy's building a modern-day community center. And in Grundy County, we asked them, we're helping with that, and they said, how do we organize all of this? And we said, well, maybe we should set up a 501c3. And I'm not trying to make fun, I'm just trying to give an example here. So what is a 501c3? So we explained that we got a law firm to help do the pro bono work for free in that instance. And we said, what is one of the primary areas of divides here? And they said, well, one of the things is that everybody's divided amongst the churches. And so we actually need a place too of where all the different churches and people that go to all these different churches can come in and not feel like they're in competition with each other, and they're on equal footing in where we are convening as well. And so just to say, now the state has also issued a grant, and that came off of that state grant. They said, well, to give you this grant, we have to have research that we're basing this grant off of. Well, luckily, and Heather is a part of this too, New Pluralist helped sponsor some of the research that went into why that community center was needed and necessary. And then that opened up $700,000 that came in from the state to invest in that community center. My point is that I think we can leverage a lot of the existing work that we're doing if we kind of figure out this way of how we do it holistically rather than in silos. And so my one piece of caution and listening is just to think about interfaith work is important, and we use the word a lot. How can we expand and open it up into other ways that people are doing maybe similar work, but they might not be calling it interfaith?
Thank you. So both of your stories are very compelling, and I heard a lot of it starts with a person, it starts with yourself, and it's out of those things that it expands and grows. Is that fair? Or a group of people. Yeah, but it's a small group. It's not a world. It's not a thousands of people movement that starts overnight. And so that led me to think about what is God calling each of us to do with this as we go forward from here. And so I'd like you to take a few minutes to just reflect on, what is God calling each of us to do as we absorb all of this incredible information and stories and passion to take out of this place into our lives.
I'm happy to share in response to that question. I have been, over the past couple of years, for a number of reasons, wanting to branch out to see how the church that I serve can partner with not the regular players, right? My question in that, the worry that I keep running up against is, how do I prevent mission creep? So I wonder, and that's something Interfaith Philadelphia also focuses on. And I was getting stressed just hearing the examples you were raising, thinking, oh my gosh. And then you ask the school, and what next? I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm just getting because I think, and I think that I would just welcome the wisdom of this group at some point on that tension about mission creep and also trying to meet the needs of the communities we're serving.
That's a great question. Other thoughts? What came to mind as you were thinking about that question?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. So, what is God calling you to do to foster interfaith discourse in your lives and your work?
I'll be brave. One of the two.
Thank you.
I always have to preface this that at Pew, you never get ahead of the board, so I don't. I can't promise that anything I'm saying I can actually follow through. That said, here are the words that came to my mind as I reflected. One is platform, excellent exemplars. I think it is really helpful. If you can use your whatever you have to platform those. I think even you telling stories is motivating. And you do have platforms. You're on TED Talks and others, but there probably are other ways to platform the work, and others that maybe don't get invited to do TED Talks that could be platformed. Bless those that are doing the work. I had a conversation with one of the persons in this room who will not be named that I'm concerned about burnout of those that are doing some of this work. So I'm thinking and meditating on what can be done to bless those that are exhausted, that are on the front lines. A third is support those that have the passion and are doing the best they possibly can, but maybe could benefit from additional skills, expertise, championing, because their organizations are small, right? And there might be things that they don't have access to. So there might be supports that organizations like mine could bring around to really advance their work. And this is just, in this space, I can also pray for those who are doing the work.
So this leaps from, filters through, requires relationship. But to ground our mission, or to reground our mission in a larger narrative of change and improvement, to leverage relationships for tangible change, like some of the examples I was hearing just now, tangible change and improvements that create needed skill sets, so that people are feeling not only that they can work toward change or improvement, but in some cases there are actual avenues where their output, their outcome is now contributing or paying it forward, be it as a coder or whatever it might be. Help create spaces for people to dream. Very important. Help get people connected to look for shared values and work to build up humanizing one another. And with all of that, bridge the disciplines for their parts at repairing community.
I can go next. I resonated a lot with, I think, Alexia, you closed with this, the potential of the future overcame the pain of the past. And so how do we spotlight that potential? And I was reminded of when I was working with Seeds of Peace in 2002, right after 9/11, we were the first group to be down on the World Trade Center site with some connections to some aid workers. And we brought kids from all of the regions we were working with, the Middle East, India, Pakistan, the Balkans. And we did like a multi-faith kind of prayer vigil, and the smoke is rising and the scent is atrocious, and you're there. And the conference was called Uprooting Hatred and Terror. And at the end, they all wrote a statement together, and they said, "We won't accept what is when we know what can be." And it was this, sorry. Whew. So your phrase reminded me of that. So how do we continue to point towards what can be in the work that we're doing? And then very personally, Samar, I was just like, what is happening in Cincinnati that I should be part of? Like, what's going on already? Where's like God and the Spirit already working? And I just got to show up, like it's there, and bring my kids.
There's something that I've been feeling acutely since. I could have used this last night as a little known fact about me, which is that I taught. It's falling apart. It's on. It was unscrewed a little bit. It's because of you. Right out of college, I graduated from college in 1980, and I taught, if you can believe this or not, I was the same height as I am now. I might have been slightly taller because you shrink. I taught second graders and junior hires in South Central LA at a little tiny church school that was essentially, it was crazy because the range was from functionally illiterate to not that any of them were incredibly prepared. So we had refugees, I call them, from the LAUSD who really couldn't do very much at all, and some incredibly bright people who were well prepared, and you had to try to figure this out. But the first lesson I figured out was there was an evening program that, families, kids, and whatever. And it was in this church building, and the front door opened onto Central Avenue in South Central LA, Central and 84th. And I still remember this. I was walked by the door, and I saw these young men who are sons of the mothers who are feeding all the people there. And there's LA County Sheriff talking to them. And I don't really think anything about it because I'm an idiot suburban white guy. I'm not, and they said, they flagged me down, not the police, but the kids. They're like, hey, Mr. Fuller, can you come here? And I said, yeah. I said, can you tell them who we are? And I'm like, wow. And I've said, explained what was on, but in my head, I'm like, this is nuts. This is their church. This is their community. And I, as a white man, can vouch for them, and everything's okay. Well, that was my realization of privilege that I don't have. But it's purely a function of being a white male. That's it. And that I remember to this day, and that was 1980 probably. And I feel this in our work, that my job is to, you use platform, but I try to think of it as center my staff, to center the people that are doing other work that we work with on our community side, to help them, to resource them in different ways so that they can do the kind of work they do better. We kind of stand in between people on the ground doing things and the kind of academic world, and aside from the academic work we do, but in the community work. So I think about that every day, and I think that I don't know if I tend to not think about callings, but it's like I feel like that's a responsibility I have.
Who else?
I have a question. Is there a risk in, and I know there are different kinds of platforms. I heard you talking about being hyper-local and that there was some danger in social media platforms and other kinds of, in national platforms and political platforms. And one thing that I run into is people always wanting to use the pulpit as a platform and online, everything as a platform. And I'm just, it's more instinct that I want to be wary of that so I can serve the people I know who've called me into a certain responsibility, and I don't want my ego to want to get out of my context by being platformed. And I do wonder, what that, because Interfaith Philadelphia, every organization now has potential if they have the staff bandwidth to be platformed, you know, and so.
Can you say what you mean by that? Being platform.
Again, there are different kinds of platforms, so I might not be thinking about it in as sophisticated a way, but I guess I'm really thinking about the internet and social media.
I think Alexia wants to.
Can I qualify what I meant by platform? This is just nothing to do with me, but I'm at Pew, which is a larger organization, and I believe is seen as being nonpartisan and objective. So there are some Jewish projects that Pew has supported, and people who have pursued funding said, thank you. I mean, our support wasn't even that much, but the fact that Pew would award them a grant gives them the potential for other funders who are not faith-based to come behind. Does that make sense? So I would say in my context, that may be what platforming may be, is for me to talk to other non-sectarian funders and say, this is an outstanding project and this is what it's doing that aligns up with your values. Does that make sense?
So I just wanted to say that when we started the New Sanctuary movement in 2007, we were on the front page of Time magazine. We had like some crazy number of hits at the time, which was new. And everybody said, oh, you all are famous. You know, Andy Warhol said 15 minutes. I think it's more like 15 seconds now. I don't think any of us has to worry about becoming our message or ourselves or anything becoming so well known that, you know, that it's going to be a distraction, because it's really, we just have to take seriously that none of it ever lasts in this modern world. What I think you're talking about, Julian, what I would want to underline is that we all can help make strategic and creative connections for each other. You know, we all have access to some kind of power in this room. And I think for me, it's very important, especially as I've gotten to be an old woman, that to be very thoughtful about how I make connections for people that have less connections. And but to also be strategic about it, because that 15-second stuff isn't really worth that much, except that it might make some connections in the moment that then you can use to make other connections for people that need them. So that's sort of how I've been thinking about it recently.
Thank you. That was perfectly put. And I would just add, what are you using the platform for and to do? And in terms of the ego, are you using it to feed your ego? Are you using it to make yourself or your organization feel self-worth? Or is it advancing your mission and your purpose? And so I think, like, if it is to do the former, then you shouldn't do it. If it's to do the latter, then think about how you do that in a way that's consistent with your values. And so, I mean, you know, the information ecosystems now are very complex, and you don't want also, I would say, what's the risk if you don't do it? What's the risk if you don't engage in a way that will reach people with a message that might move them towards the positive rather than towards the negative?
Similar, it's like the world I operate in. I mean, the less you have to fight over, the harder you fight for it. And so academic pride is a thing. And where I went, and I realized this in grad school, that these people are incredibly famous in this really tiny world. And as soon as they retire or die, they didn't exist anymore. It is the weirdest thing. But there's incredible competition, promotion, self-promotion about it. And that's sort of, I think, in a number of, including my life experiences, is like, that's what I don't want to do. And I don't want CRCC to be that, to promote me or anybody individually, because what's the kind of work that we can promote? The kind of work we can promote is what can we know about the world and about religion in the world, so that extends our understanding, but also helps groups that are trying to do good things in the world do it better. And that's fundamentally the mission of our center. And I increasingly see that as fundamentally how I think about what I do as an academic who also straddles that world in a way that I have randomly been called a faith leader. I'm like, what are you talking about? So.
Here, and then, were you going to say something, Stephanie?
So I think there we go. So I think one of the ways I think about this whole question of platforming, I go back to when I was teaching. And for the last probably decade of my teaching, I changed my methodology substantially so that I was attentive to whose questions I was framing a curriculum around. So which questions were the ones that were being normalized as being the significant kinds of issues that theology dealt with? And one of the ways that I then dealt with that piece is it finally occurred to me that I actually was the theology professor for all of my students. And what that meant was that I was teaching them how to do theology. So if I developed a curriculum that was only women and people of color, that's all they would know, right? They wouldn't know anything else because they hadn't been in an intro to theology before. So the question of platforming for me then became, in terms of the whole epistemological issue of the construction of religious knowledge for these future faith leaders, is whose experience is at the center of gravity for your theological reflection, for your moral culpability, for your way of understanding your being in the world. So then it sort of moved away from, I won't say it moved away from, but it moved toward normalizing experiences of communities that, I care about. Because one of the things that my work was, and this is in all of my writing and whatnot, is the firm belief that Howard Thurman was right, and when he said that most dispossessed communities have to mortgage tomorrow to put the porridge of the day on their table. And so what that means is that if all of us are thinking about how to resist the system and not thinking about, and this is a little bit going to your point, not thinking about how we can change what comes next, then we'll find that we're forever in the digestive system of the beast instead of in its head. And so, anyhow, that's the way I thought about platforming.
Could you say that one phrase about mortgaging tomorrow again? I didn't get it in my notes.
Oh, it was in Jesus and the Disinherited, and it was mortgaging tomorrow for the porridge, which is simply the stew, right? The cold stew of today.
Heather, I'm going to ask you a question that you can refuse to answer. Okay. But my sense is that the Templeton Foundation has an enormous platform, yet you use it with great humility. How have you, as a group, found that balance?
Oh, here you go.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that kind comment that we use our platform with humility. How have we found that balance? Well, I'll say one thing about social media. There was a time when the communications department wanted me to be very present on social media, and we decided LinkedIn was a better platform than Twitter. And I was getting I was getting a list every week from the communications team. They were happy to post on LinkedIn on my behalf, and I didn't want them to do that. And then they were sending me a list of things to post on LinkedIn. And I would go through phases. I always said, you could tell when I was really, and I don't actually really post very much now at all, but you could tell when I was stressed because I wouldn't post very much. I just didn't have the muse, and I didn't have the opportunity to think about it. So I think just on that platform of social media, it's one voice out of millions and gazillions, right? It can also be a platform where one little mistake can have serious ramifications. So I think I feel the weight of that more. So that kind of platform doesn't seem as valuable, though we're on Twitter and things like that. I think for us as an institution, we have always we used to refer to part of our work as science and the big questions. We've just always valued questions instead of edicts come to mind, but instead of defining the debate or making proclamations or even taking a position. And so that's how we live into that value of humility, is being motivated by a question. If you have a question that's aligned with our mission and our funding interests, then that is where we can partner up on something. And if you make a good case for why the question is important, if you propose a sound methodology and then you get funding, then you're off. Tell us what you find out. And we're happy to promote it through our systems if we can, or fund other podcast hosts to promote you separately. But I think that's where it comes from. So we're motivated by questions. We don't know the final answers. One of the mottos that my grandfather lived by was, how little we know, how eager to learn. And I think that ethos is just prevalent in who we are as individuals and then how we show up in the world. It all comes from my grandfather, though. So it's interesting how that kind of powerful way of thinking, it's very like the Beata way, right? I mean, that really came to fruition from who you are, Mark. And you brought people, you didn't want it to be just you, but that act of bringing people into the conversation, I think that interplay led to the Beata way. And it'll be exciting to see how that sustains over the generations. But I think that's how we show up in the world.
Another thing that's occurred to me is, I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to.
Reminding me that I do this. Thank you.
It's my job.
So another thing that occurred to me earlier, we were talking about kind of this pressure for branding, that, you know, the younger generation has this thing about building your brand, standing out, individualism. How does that either enable or impede the ability for us to really have an impact in encouraging these kinds of conversations?
I would just say, I think we've touched on this a lot today, and that it gets back to trust. And there's a significant trust deficit. So how can one trust the brand? How can one trust what is behind the brand? I mean, we're in a suspicious environment, you know? And so I think like how do you navigate that space, and who are you navigating it with, and who is it that you're trying to reach with your brand? Who are you speaking to? Who are you trying to connect with?
One of the things that I say a lot to the young people that I mentor is that I've made an intentional decision in my life often not to brand myself, because I actually have more power not branding. So 2 examples quickly is, one is I did the curriculum for World Vision for their grassroots organizing internationally. If I put my name on it, people that like me will like it, but people that don't like me, don't believe in women pastors, don't like Latinas, would not like the curriculum. It has or people that don't like that I was born in the US, it has much wider play because my name wasn't on it. So I don't have to give the other. I mean, that's been a consistent decision for me, that there's often times when you can do way more if some good work is not identified with your name. So you have to make that decision. You have to make, does this advance the work? The question you asked, does it advance the work, or does it detract from the work?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I would say, like, a lot of times I found myself actually not putting my name on things for that reason. I will also say it comes with risk. And it comes with risk because if people find out that you are, then they want to know why you're not being public about it. And so then they're suspicious as to why you're being behind the scenes. So it's constantly, this is a very tricky environment we're in. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad, and thank you Interfaith Philadelphia for bringing us all together, because I just feel like it's the power in putting our heads together around stuff like this in a dynamic environment of where we might be having a different conversation in a year from now about how we address this.
This word And in this conference we had just right before Thanksgiving, one of the people that has come to lots of our programming, maybe he's heard us say it a lot, but he actually pointed that out, that it was okay to have these different opinions in this. It was a pretty tense room for a while. And that made me feel really good about that, if you want to call that branding on our part, that message is getting out, and people feel safe, a safe place to be there and be themselves authentically and to share their ideas and be in communication and conflict, which we don't overtly encourage it, but I don't have that much of a problem with it in terms of, conflict of ideas, because I think good things come out of that. So I think that's something we've tried to say in terms of the yourself or not. It's like we have the luxury to speak as an organization and to speak individually. So there are things that we'll write that's just from CRCC and things that we'll write that come from one or another of us, depending on what it is. But it's a slightly different animal because of and we don't have nearly as much at stake as, say, Heather does. So, yeah.
One of the really interesting things about looking at brands who are most trusted by younger generations right now is the way that they're using celebrity differently. So instead of getting celebrities to tell their story, so Michael Jordan, pitching McDonald's to you in the 1990s or something, is that they're building trust by telling other people's stories. And so, like, one of the reasons why Nike is so beloved by young people is because they feel like Nike is telling the stories of all the people that they care about. And part of the reason Nike's able to do that is because Nike tells everybody's story. Like, they don't actually have to this is savvy politically, but like, they don't have to take a stand in some ways because they're taking all the stands. And that can be problematic, but it's effective. Fabletics is doing the same thing. It's a huge brand that young people love. And it's because they're telling the stories of people whose stories have not largely been told. They're not trying to shine the light back to them all the time. Anyway, and I think there's a real lesson there for how we operate in faith spaces too. So when we ask, like, okay, so it's my pulpit. Well, it's the pulpit that I'm in. It's the pulpit. Is this my platform? Well, what if we use that to tell other people's stories from that space who aren't normally here? I think we actually gain more credibility that way than the opposite. Anybody else besides Sarah who is now given up
Well, I'm also thinking about branding more in we talk about identity, right? And I think when we say individualism, we really mean individuality. And I'm thinking about young people who are in the process of developing their identities and being able to articulate what that identity is and what they believe and who they are and what they want to be in the world. And I don't. I'm a millennial. I don't think that there is any downside to looking to have that uniqueness, individuality, defining it, living it, as long as you're open to it also changing, because we all know that our identities change. And I think that, the question about does that enable or impede the ability for us to, to have these conversations and to have impact? One of the things, Gavin, that I loved that you said last night was, don't be afraid to disagree with each other, because that's what we need for this room, for us to get anywhere, right? And we know that exists, and we don't want to come together, Alexia, in the lowest common denominator, right? We want to come together from this difference, and I think that exists within these smaller group interactions as well, which can be the spark that leads someone somewhere else. And I think about that within, the conversation around the youth, but also in the conversation around what society looks like in all of the spaces that we're in a place where you don't have to be polite, where you don't have to conform. What magic would be able to emerge if that was the case?
Any additional thoughts? So why don't we take a break? We'll reconvene at 3:15, so that'll give you a little bit of time to get up and move around. And then we'll come back and really think about, okay, now what are the implications of all of this as we think about our religious community?